The year was 1888. New York City, a monstrous heart of brick and ambition, beat with the furious rhythm of change. The Gilded Age, glittering with unimaginable fortunes and shadowed by unspeakable poverty, was at its zenith. Down in the narrow, cobblestone arteries of lower Manhattan, where gas lamps cast a sickly yellow glow against the pre-dawn mist, the air tasted of coal smoke, brine from the docks, and the sharp, metallic tang of boundless possibility. Eleanor Vance, 22, and a woman who understood the precise utility of a well-placed buttonhole, pulled her wool coat tighter. She was heading north, away from the grimy hustle of the printing press, where she worked as a junior typesetter, a rarity for a woman of her class, and toward the quiet, brownstone elegance of Gramercy Park. Her task this morning was not ink and lead, but a secret commission from her employer, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, owner of the city's most respected and most discreet independent press. The envelope in her hand was heavy, sealed with a bespoke wax stamp, a stylized owl gripping a key. It was addressed to one Professor Alastair Finch, a man whose name was whispered in certain intellectual and occult circles, though never shouted. He was an antiquarian, a horologist obsessed with the measurement of time, and, rumor had it, the keeper of secrets that stretched back before the discovery of the New World. "Gramercy Square, number 19, she murmured, checking the engraved brass plate on the gate. The house was an anomaly, a 3-story brick structure with a dark, almost forbidding facade, sitting incongruously beside the bright, exuberant ornamentation of its neighbors. It seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Eleanor knocked, the sound feeling disproportionately loud in the morning quiet. The door was opened not by a servant, but by the professor himself. Alastair Finch was a man who looked like he had been meticulously carved from old oak, tall, lean, with a hawk-like nose and eyes of an unsettling pale blue that seemed to look through her, not at her. He wore a velvet smoking jacket over a striped waistcoat, attire better suited for midnight contemplation than a brisk morning call. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that penetrated the gloomy hallway, illuminating a chaotic landscape of stacked books, astronomical charts, and mechanical parts, brass gears, polished lenses, and coils of wire scattered across every surface. The whole house hummed with a low mechanical thrum. "Miss Vance," he greeted, his voice a dry rasp, like rustling parchment. He recognized her from previous, smaller deliveries. "You are punctual, a virtue rapidly vanishing from this vulgar age." The date is January 15th, 1919. The city is Boston, Massachusetts, the ancient, dignified heart of American liberty. The morning air, as it often is in a New England winter, is crisp, bracing, and smells faintly of the sea. But today, the city air holds a sweetness, a dense, dark, almost sickly aroma that clings to the cobblestone streets of the North End. It is the smell of the massive, looming iron tank on Commercial Street, a colossal structure standing 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter. It held over 2 million gallons of crude molasses. This is not a story of ice, fire, or wind. It is a true American disaster born of hubris, greed, and a viscous, sugary wave of destruction. It is the story of the Great Molasses Flood. The setting is crucial. The year 1919 was a moment of profound transformation in American society. World War I had just ended, bringing home a sense of hurried industry and a disregard for safety in the pursuit of profit. But more importantly, the United States was standing on the precipice of a seismic cultural shift: Prohibition. The 18th Amendment was imminent. On January 16th, just one day after our story begins, the amendment would be ratified, ushering in the age of alcohol prohibition. This, incredibly, is why the 2-million-gallon tank of molasses existed. The tank belonged to the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA Company. USIA was not making syrup for pancakes. They were using the molasses, a cheap, vital byproduct of sugar refining, to ferment into industrial alcohol. This alcohol was critical for wartime explosives and, more profitably, for rum. With Prohibition looming, USIA was desperate to maximize its rum production before the national tops were sealed shut. The saste was the first fatal crack in the tank's iron walls. The tank itself had been hastily constructed in 1915 in a climate of rushed war contracts. Neighbors immediately complained. They described the tank groaning, rattling, and making strange metallic noises. They spoke of dark, sticky molasses leaking from seams and pooling on the streets, which local children, despite the warnings, collected in jars. Arthur Gell, the treasurer of Purity Distilling, was in charge of the construction. When warned by his own staff about the dangerous condition of the tank, Gell dismissed the concerns. He ordered the tank to be painted dark brown, the color of the molasses itself, to hide the leaks. He conducted no pressure tests. He simply ignored every red flag raised by the engineers and the community. His logic, like so much of the era's industrial thinking, was chillingly simple. Time is money, and the war effort and the looming deadline of Prohibition was paramount. The molasses itself, a sticky, dark gold commodity, represented an enormous asset in that final frantic week. It had been recently delivered, arriving via a ship from the Caribbean. The new, cold molasses was still fermenting and producing carbon dioxide, which generated internal pressure. This was the silent, invisible force acting on the already structurally compromised tank. January 15th dawns with an unseasonable warmth. The temperature, which had been below freezing, shot up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, about 4.4 degrees Celsius. This rapid rise in temperature was the final critical factor. The cold molasses inside the tank expanded, increasing the already immense internal pressure by a factor that the thinly riveted steel walls simply could not withstand. The people of the North End, a vibrant, working-class neighborhood largely populated by Italian immigrants, knew nothing of the danger. Children were walking home from school. Workers were finishing their midday meals.
Firefighters were having lunch in Engine House 31, a station located directly across the street from the mammoth tank. For them, it was just another Wednesday. They could smell the sweet air. They could hear the distant sounds of the elevated train on the overhead railway. What they couldn't hear was the final, microscopic yielding of steel rivets, strained past their breaking point by the forces of physics and corporate negligence. The scene is set. A perfect American disaster, built on faulty engineering, covered by brown paint, pressurized by fermentation, and triggered by a sudden, warm winter day. The city is breathing in the sweet smell of its own impending doom. The clock ticks toward 12:30 p.m.
The idea was outlandish, yet the man's conviction was absolute. Map time? How, Professor? By tracking what I call the temporal echoes, Finch explained, picking up a small lens-like tool. Every great city, every concentration of human endeavor leaves an imprint on the ether. New York's imprint is a cacophony. But this chronometer, when active, is meant to isolate a single echo, a powerful, sustained moment in time that defines the city's fate. He hesitated, his pale eyes narrowing. And according to Arthur's message, an unsavory party has also become aware of the chronometer's recovery. They seek to use it to reshape those echoes, to rewrite the map. Who are they? The Consortium of the Gilded Hour, a cabal of the city's industrial titans, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, the Rockefellers. They call themselves Patriots of Progress, but in truth they are thieves of the future. They are terrified of what the future holds, the end of their absolute power. They believe this device will allow them to lock the city, and by extension the nation, into a permanent state of their control. Arthur's note warns that they have hired a specialist, a fixer. He turned to Eleanor, a sudden, urgent gravity in his face. Miss Vance, your work at the press gives you access to society's secrets. Your eye for detail, a typesetter's eye, is what I need. You must navigate the polite world of the Gilded Hour and help me secure the chronometer before it falls into the hands of a man who can turn back the clocks on American democracy itself. He pointed to a small, hidden safe behind a bookshelf. The chronometer must be taken immediately to a neutral location. My laboratory is compromised. We begin with the most unlikely of places. Eleanor felt the city's vast, silent potential pressing down on her. The gaslight flickered. She, a mere typesetter, was being asked to step onto a stage where the fate of New York's history, past, present, and future, was the prize. "Very well, Professor," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic pulse in her throat. "What are my instructions?" Finch smiled, a brief, sharp flash of white in the gloom. "First, Miss Vance, we must understand the fixer. His name is as much a shadow as the consortium itself. They call him the cartographer." The pastor led Eli to the hidden room. Tucked behind a loose brick was not a typical book, but a series of thin, brittle sheets of vellum, the ledger. But it was not filled with names and dates. It was covered in musical notation. Eli, the cartographer's son, spread the vellum out on a dusty table. This was Charlot's true genius. The ledger was a musical cipher. The maestro hadn't been a financial boss.
He had been a composer who had used the very tempo of the Jazz Age as his secret language. The staff lines and notes corresponded to an ancient Medina cipher, a rare, obscure code used by Renaissance-era cartographers to hide strategic military information on plain maps. As Eli worked frantically, translating the musical notes into letters, the door to the church burst open. It was not the Black Hand. It was the Americanized Mafia, a crew of Johnny Torrio's men, led by a ruthless second-generation gangster named Sal Morano. They wore cheap suits, smelled of the distilleries, and carried the new, terrifying instruments of the Jazz Age underworld, Thompson submachine guns. "The Ledger of the Fox," Morano sneered, his accent a slick mix of New York and Chicago. "We thought it burned with the old fool. The boss wants it. It contains too much truths about how we acquired our control. Hand it over, Vance." Eli backed away, shielding the fragile papers. "It's just sheet music, Morano, a forgotten tune." "A tune that names the judges, the police captains, and the politicians we bought to drive the old men out of business. A tune that could put a bullet in every one of us," Morano corrected, raising the muzzle of the Tommy gun. "It also names the traitor who fed Charlo false information for years." Suddenly, the front door of the church opened again, slowly. Standing silhouetted against the streetlights, cane in hand, was the tall man from the north side, the man who smelled of old tobacco. He looked frail, yet his eyes held the cold authority of a king. It was Filippo Charlo, the maestro, the fox. He was alive. "You're late, Salvatore." Charlo's voice was a dry rasp, a ghost of a whisper. 23 years late to collect your debt." Morano's jaw dropped. "The fox? Impossible." "Nothing is impossible, Salvatore, when you control the information," Charlo said, stepping into the dim light. "Mr. Vance, the cartographer's eye was not for finding the map, but for reading it. The music you see, those notes, are the coordinates for a single location." As Charlo spoke, a siren began to wail outside, a sound that in the 1920s meant either the police or, more likely, a rival gang war. Morano's crew turned, momentarily distracted. Eli seized the moment. He had already finished the final line of translation. The cipher did not name the traitor. It named a destination. He shouted the decoded name, just as Charlo's men, who had been hiding in the shadows of the church's balcony, opened fire on Morano's gang. "It's not a ledger, Morano. It's a blueprint. The notes spell out the South Side Savings and Trust, Vault 7. The ensuing chaos was a blur of lead, plaster dust, and panicked shouts.
Eli, fueled by adrenaline, grabbed the vellum and dove out the side window into a thicket of overgrown bushes. He left behind a church shattered by gunfire, a dying mafia soldier, and the chilling realization that he had just become the sole possessor of the deepest secret of Chicago's criminal war. He ran, the fear of the Black Hand's mystical threat replaced by the immediate terror of the Tommy gun. The Southside Savings and Trust was a massive, respectable financial institution, the ultimate symbol of Chicago's booming yet fragile new wealth. What had the maestro hidden there? He reached the bank just as dawn was breaking. The security was minimal, but the massive steel vault was intimidating. Eli, using the last of his contacts, managed to gain access to the bank's night manager, a perpetually nervous man named Mr. Finch. "Vault 7, Mr. Finch. I need access now. It's a matter of state security." Finch laughed, a thin, reedy sound. "Vault 7, Mr. Vance. That vault has been sealed for 15 years. It belongs to the estate of an eccentric Italian immigrant who went missing in 1912, a Mr. Charlo. No one has the key." Eli pulled the final sheet of vellum from his coat. The musical staff lines did not end in notes. They ended in a series of meticulously drawn geometric shapes. A star, a crescent, and a perfect circle overlaying one another.
"The maestro left his own key," Eli whispered, recognizing the symbols as the ancient Sardinian master key sequence. He convinced Finch, through a mix of terror and sheer confidence, to allow him near the lock. Following the pattern on the vellum, Eli manipulated the locking mechanism in a sequence Finch had never seen. With a hydraulic hiss and a final metallic groan, the great steel door of Vault 7 swung open.
Inside, there was not gold, nor jewels, nor even incriminating documents. There were only two things: a heavy leather-bound volume, richly embossed, the true ledger of the maestro, a single tarnished brass compass. Eli tore open the leather-bound book. It was not a list of names. It was a dense, meticulously handwritten memoir and economic theory. Charlo, the fox, had not been a simple extortionist. He had been an economist of the underworld. His ledger detailed a plan begun in 1910 to create a massive, undetectable, alternative banking system across the U.S., funded by the illicit profits of the Black Hand's early years. This system was designed to serve the marginalized, the disenfranchised Italian immigrants the bank shunned, and later the black migrants of the Great Migration who couldn't get loans. The extortion was not for personal wealth, but capital. A vast shadow reserve used to buy land and businesses in segregated areas, then leased back to the communities at fair rates. The ledger was a blueprint for a shadow republic of equitable finance. But the last entry, dated 1912, was chilling. The traitor has done his work. He has convinced the young Americans of the Mafia that the great work is about money, not justice. They will consume it all, and the promise of the new world will turn to dust. I leave this key with the cartographer's eye to one who knows the meaning of the forgotten lines. Eli looked at the compass. It was a surveyor's compass, like his father's, but the needle spun wildly, drawn to some powerful, unseen magnetic pole. Eli realized the truth. The traitor was not one of Charlo's rivals, but the spirit of American greed itself, embodied by the younger, industrial-scale gangsters who seized the Black Hand's capital during Prohibition. They didn't want the justice of the system. They wanted the money to fuel their war for vice. His task was not done. He had the ledger, but the compass was the real key, the final, most surprising piece of the maestro's legacy. He knew where he had to go. The compass was not pointing north or south. It was drawn to the one place in the city where all lines of power converged: the Chicago Board of Trade, the epicenter of speculation, commodity trading, and the raw, untamed hunger that drove the city. He arrived at the towering neoclassical building as the trading floor was opening. The noise was deafening, a roar of human voices, shouting bids, demanding futures. He spotted the fox, Ciarlo, now dressed in a fine banker's suit, standing on the balcony above the fray. He looked not like a gangster, but a weary prophet, watching his dark dream dissolve into a vulgar reality. "The compass, Mr. Vance," Ciarlo rasped over the roar. "It points to the core of the speculation engine. Throw it!" Eli saw Sal Morano and his remaining crew pushing through the crowd on the floor, their eyes fixed on the ledger in Eli's hand. Eli clutched the heavy brass compass. It was not simply a relic. As a cartographer's son, he recognized the aged metal, a rare, naturally radioactive alloy once used in deep-sea nautical tools. Its magnetism was genuine.
He hurled the compass with all his strength, aiming for the central pulpit, the elevated stand where the chief speculator directed the frenzy. The compass struck the metal frame of the pulpit with a deafening clang. The effect was instantaneous, bizarre, and terrifying. The hypersensitive instruments used to track the movement of commodity prices, the telegraph ticker tapes, the massive synchronized wall clocks, all went haywire. The powerful magnetism of the ancient compass, amplified by the iron and steel of the trading pit, scrambled the delicate electrical current of the entire floor. The tickers stuttered and spat nonsense. The clocks froze. The human roar of the traders, suddenly bereft of their digital pulse, choked and died. A strange total silence fell over the most frenetic room in America. Ciarlo smiled, a tragic, defeated expression. The compass of truth, Mr. Vance. It was always intended to disrupt the false measure of greed. It was a one-time charge. In the silence, the sheer weight of their unregulated wealth felt heavy and exposed. Morano's men stopped, staring at the frozen clocks, the sudden loss of control terrifying them more than any gunfight. Eli held up the ledger. "The maestro's true work is not dead, Murano. It is recorded. And now the men who truly built this city, the immigrants, the farmers, the Southsiders, they have the map to your secret empire." Eli never turned the ledger over to the corrupt Chicago police. Instead, with the help of Dr. Eleanor Roth, he used the encrypted economic data to quietly expose the mafia's land speculation and political payoffs through a series of anonymous articles in the Chicago Defender, the South Side's powerful black newspaper. The Black Hand was gone, replaced by the organized crime of the mafia, but Chiarlo's legacy survived. The ledger became the intellectual blueprint for a series of new independent community banks, Black-owned, Jewish-owned, and Italian immigrant-owned, that utilized Chiarlo's principles of cooperative finance. Eli Vance, the cartographer's son, found his true calling. He did not become a gangster or a police detective. He became a financial architect, using the tools of the underworld to build the very equity that the respectable American system had denied to millions of its citizens. He had not only solved a crime, but had discovered a remarkable secret history of resistance and economic empowerment hidden within the spectacular corruption of the Jazz Age. The music had drowned the sin, and the light, the everlasting light of a fair chance, had finally begun to burn. The exposure in the Chicago Defender had been a seismic shock, a silent detonation that rearranged the city's power grid. It didn't bring down Al Capone, not directly, but it exposed the foundation of his wealth, the politicians and bankers who had secretly bought up the Great Migration's most valuable real estate, using the seed money of the original Black Hand. The federal authorities, smelling blood and tax evasion, began to circle. Eli Vance, however, found himself hunted not by the feds, but by the maestro, Filippo Charlo himself. Charlo met him under the elevated tracks on Wabash Avenue, the L train roaring overhead every few minutes, momentarily drowning out all conversation, a perfect cover for conspirators. Charlo looked older now, his banker's suit draped over a fragile frame, but his eyes were sharp. "You used the ledger for journalism, Mr. Vance, a noble trade, but a temporary disruption. The Defender prints truths, the city prints money. Which one do you think is more powerful?" Eli leaned against a greasy pillar. "Your ledger was a blueprint for a fairer bank, Maestro, not a tool for vengeance. I honored the spirit of your great work, not your private war." "The two are inseparable," Charlo countered, his smoke curling into the dim light. "I didn't lead you to the Board of Trade merely to freeze a few tickers. I led you there because the traitor is there. Not a spirit of greed, Mr. Vance, but a man." Charlo pulled a folded paper from his sleeve. It was the last piece of vellum, the true final page of the ledger. Unlike the others, it contained no musical cipher, only a name, A.S. Lattimore. Lattimore was my chief financial advisor. He was the true cartographer of my shadow system, an American. When Prohibition hit, he didn't betray me to Torrio for money. He betrayed me for legitimacy. Lattimore is now the silent partner in the Southside Trust, the same bank you entered. He holds the legal deeds to every piece of property I bought for the migrants, and he's preparing to sell them all to Capone's front companies, effectively erasing the Black Metropolis. The amazing and factual core of the story deepened the actual historical struggle over land deeds and property ownership in the South Side during the Great Migration, where exploitative landlords and corrupt bankers used legal loopholes to fleece black families. "If the ledger is true," Eli said, realizing the true scale of the disaster, "then Lattimore has documentation of all the true ownership. He's not just a speculator, he's an economic assassin." "Precisely, and he is protected by the law he so loves to break," Charlo said. "I need you to recover the original deeds that Lattimore concealed. They are the only way to prove his treason and prevent the destruction of a community I tried, in my own strange way, to save."
Ciarlo did the most surprising thing of all. He handed Eli a heavy, antique lockpick set, finely wrought from brass and steel. "This is the cartographer's true eye. A good cartographer knows the layout of the land, but a great one knows the paths through the walls. Lattimore's legal office is located in the Reliance Building, the new skyscraper on State Street. Go there, find the hidden office he uses for his illicit affairs. Use the tool, finish the work." With a final desperate look, the fox melted into the roaring shadow of the passing train, leaving Eli alone with the scent of smoke, the burden of a city's history, and the name of a white-collar criminal who wore the mask of respectability. The Reliance Building was a palace of glass and terracotta, an astonishing monument to Chicago's progressive architectural ambition.
Its steel frame seemed to scrape the sky, a jarring contrast to the older brick and timber of the city. This was the citadel of the men who dealt in futures, land, and abstract wealth. A.S. Lattimore's world. Eli used his professional cover as a private investigator to gain entry, but his true skill was the one Ciarlo had identified: the ability to see hidden structures. He scanned the blueprints Lattimore's secretary reluctantly showed him. The 23rd floor showed an anomaly, a space listed as mechanical access, but accessible only through Lattimore's private office. He waited until after midnight, climbing the external fire escape like a ghost of the city's past, until he reached Lattimore's office. The sleek, modern lock was no match for Ciarlo's ancient lockpicks, each tool a small, perfect piece of engineering. Inside the quiet, enormous office, Eli found the access panel, hidden behind a heavy mahogany bookshelf. The door led to a tiny, windowless room, clearly Lattimore's true operational center. On a table sat a single, massive safe. Eli felt a spike of frustration. He was a master of geography and cipher, not combination locks. The weight of the brass compass suddenly felt like a joke. Then he noticed the small framed certificate of incorporation hanging on the wall. It was for Lattimore's main front company, and the date of incorporation was July 4th, 1920, the exact day Ciarlo was rumored to have been killed. The date was the key. Lattimore, Eli realized, had been mocking Ciarlo all along. The combination wasn't random. It was tied to a date that signified his new American independence from the old Italian ways.
Eli sat down, his heart pounding a frantic jazz rhythm against his ribs. He worked the tumbler, using the numeric sequence of July 4, 1920, the day, the month, the last 2 digits of the year, and the founding year of the Republic, 1776, a number Ciarlo, an intellectual deeply steeped in the occult history of American nation-building, would have known was important to the former accountant. 742076. With a soft, elegant thunk, the safe opened. Inside the safe lay 3 things: a stack of brittle original land deeds bearing the true names of the South Side families Ciarlo had bought the land for. They were legally binding and priceless. A meticulously organized confession, addressed to no one, detailing Lattimore's systematic betrayal of Ciarlo and his planned resale of the land to Capone's consortium. A large, official-looking document, rubber-stamped and sealed. A United States patent application for a new, revolutionary financial tracking system. The patent was the final, most unbelievable piece of information. A.S. Lattimore hadn't just stolen Ciarlo's system, he had perfected it. Ciarlo's Shadow Republic system, which used cooperative economics and a secret ledger, was being streamlined by Lattimore into a legitimate legal mechanism for tracking wealth, property, and capital movement across state lines. The invention would allow the federal government, or anyone who controlled it, to finally track and tax the vast hidden profits of organized crime. Lattimore was not just a traitor, he was a financial revolutionary. His betrayal of Ciarlo wasn't for Capone's money alone, but for the chance to introduce his invention.
an invention he knew would ultimately destroy the lawless freedom of the Prohibition era, including Capone's empire, from the top down. He wanted to trade the old Black-Hand chaos for a new, ruthlessly efficient and legitimate order. Eli felt the weight of history settle on his shoulders. He could use the deeds to save the South Side, and he could use the confession to expose Lattimore. But if he exposed Lattimore, the patent, the key to the future of federal law enforcement and the eventual destruction of the Mafia, might be lost. A light flickered in the hallway. Lattimore had returned. Eli had seconds. He bundled the land deeds and the confession into his coat. He took one last look at the patent application. He knew that if this invention was introduced, the entire world of illicit finance would shatter. Capone would fall, but the power of the federal government would increase tenfold. The door handle turned. Eli, using the skill of the cartographer, moved silently into the ventilation shaft, pulling the grate closed just as Lattimore entered the room. "Mr. Vance, I knew Ciarlo would send someone. He always romanticized chaos. I prefer order." Lattimore walked straight to the open safe and sighed when he saw the documents missing. The metallic scent of ozone and the deep throbbing vibration of the temporal fracture spurred Eleanor, Finch, and the dazed 18th century woman into action. Sirens, distant but inevitable, were already wailing across the river. The police detail, likely O'Malley's men, would be on them within minutes. "We must move," Finch hissed, grabbing Eleanor's good arm. The shrapnel wound on her shoulder was bleeding, but adrenaline kept her moving. "Who are you? What year is this?" the woman from the past demanded, her pistol, a highly ornate flintlock, leveled unsteadily at Eleanor. "The year is 1888. I am Professor Finch, a horologist, and this is Miss Vance. You are an unexpected consequence of temporal interference. Put the weapon down. You are in no danger from us." "My name is Abigail Wentworth," the courier stated, lowering the flintlock fractionally as she surveyed the impossibly high steel cables and the distant electrified skyline. The modern world clearly terrified her, but her rigid military posture suggested discipline overriding fear. "I carry a sealed manifest for General Washington, intended only for the hands of the Marquis de Lafayette. I was ambushed. I need the cipher." They couldn't stay. Finch, despite his exhaustion, quickly fashioned a makeshift sling for Eleanor, then directed them down the maintenance path, abandoning the catastrophic wreckage of the chronometer. They slipped into the labyrinthine streets of the Brooklyn docks just as the first police whistles echoed on the promenade above. The decryption at the print shop. Finch led them to the only safe harbor he knew, the deserted pre-dawn offices of Arthur Penhaligon's press in Lower Manhattan. Safe because Penhaligon's specialized work, printing classified political pamphlets and rare scientific texts, guaranteed discretion and soundproofing. In the ink-stained silence of the typesetting room, Eleanor poured cheap whiskey over her wound, while Finch tried to process the historical shock of Abigail. "Abigail Wentworth, you are nearly 112 years from your own time. The Marquis is dead. General Washington is a monument." Abigail paled, but her grip on the waterlogged naval manifest did not waver. "Then the danger is greater than I imagined. I am a courier for the Committee of Secret Correspondence. I was carrying the manifest to a waiting French frigate.
It documents the only leverage the Congress had left, the true location of the gold and silver specie, the cipher that secures the Dutch loan's repayment. The realization hit Finch with the force of a hammer. The loan! The cartographer was right. The loan was a sham, designed to fail. He intended to expose it. No, Abigail interrupted, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused. The loan was an insurance policy. General Washington knew the debt would be politically vulnerable. This manifest is the key to the collateral. It details the location of the Continental Treasury's true reserves, hidden not in specie, but in a vast untapped deposit of pure copper and nickel ore, essential for the Industrial Revolution that was to come. A future resource, hidden for a future need.
The cartographer's plot wasn't to expose a lie. It was to destroy the truth that protected America's solvency. The financial foundation was solid, but the cartographer sought to bury the evidence of that foundation forever. Finch carefully took the wet, decaying manifest. It was a list of weights, ship names, and coordinates, all highly coded. "It's a polyalphabetic cipher," he muttered, running his fingers over the text. "The shift keys must be historical references, something only the committee and the marquis would know." Eleanor, her mind buzzing despite the pain, recognized the need for a typesetter's precision. "The shift keys. I know the history of the committee's codes. They often use the length of famous speeches or the height of key landmarks as the numerical shift values." Working side by side, Eleanor and Finch, the Gilded Age's finest minds, collaborated with a Revolutionary War spy. Abigail provided the essential context. The ship names referred to specific battalions. The weights referred to the line counts in a particular issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette. The final coordinate. After an intense hour of decryption, fueled by coffee and desperation, the truth emerged. The final, deciphered coordinate was not a place in 1776, but a place in their time. Lat, 40 degrees, 41 minutes, 21 seconds north. Long, 74 degrees, 2 minutes, 40 seconds west. Finch recognized the numbers instantly. The location of the ore is not a mine, nor a vault. It is a structure. And those coordinates point directly to Liberty Island. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. The Statue of Liberty. Libertas. The largest single copper structure in the world, Finch finished, a terrible awe in his voice. Installed in 1886, 1 year before the centennial of the loan's potential repayment. It is a brilliant, audacious concealment. The entire statue, its copper skin, its nickel-steel frame, is the collateral itself, the physical proof of America's wealth standing in plain sight. The Statue of Liberty was not just a gift from France, it was the ultimate hidden treasury of the American Revolution. Finch looked at the damaged Continental chronometer key. The cartographer must be heading there. He has the broken chronometer, but he now knows the purpose of the key. He won't try to alter the timeline's perception. He will attempt to destroy the physical proof. But how could he destroy a landmark that large? Eleanor asked, disbelief warring with terror. He is an engineer of time, Miss Vance. The chronometer is broken, yes, but it still generated a temporal instability. If he could rig the chronometer at the statue's base, at the point of highest copper density, he could trigger a localized temporal collapse. It wouldn't just destroy the statue, it would erase the historical legitimacy of the revolution's financial foundation, making America appear born of fraud and debt. The call to arms. They had to reach Liberty Island. They had the key to program the chronometer, if it could be repaired, and they had the cipher, the manifest, that explained the statue's true purpose. But they had no way to get to the island undetected, and the cartographer would be preparing his final attack.
Abigail, the courier, stepped forward, flintlock pistol secured in her belt. If the goal is to protect the foundation of this nation, I will not stand idle. My mission is still viable. We need a distraction, and we need specialized transport. O'Malley's police would be watching the ferry terminal. We need a way to slip past the eyes of Tammany Hall. Eleanor, despite her pain, had an idea. Mick O'Malley works for Silas Thorne, a member of the consortium. But who works against Thorne? William Boss Tweed is gone, but the machine is still fractured.
She picked up the phone, a recent addition to Penn Halligan's private office, and cranked the receiver. Professor, you said the consortium was terrified the cartographer might betray them. That means their enemies might suddenly find him a common target. She began to speak into the mouthpiece, her voice low and confident. Get me the night editor at the New York World. I have a story that will shake Fifth Avenue to its foundations. It's about a railroad baron, a politician named Thorne, and a secret war over the copper used to build Lady Liberty. By manufacturing a massive public scandal, a media echo, Eleanor planned to use the press to draw the consortium's attention away from the island and onto their own survival, forcing Thorne and Astor to pull O'Malley's forces back to Manhattan. The plan was set. Eleanor would use the press to create a cover story. Finch would attempt to jury-rig the chronometer key to act as an unstable temporal disruptor. And Abigail, the 18th century soldier, would secure their transport to the final battlefield, the foundation of the Statue of Liberty. The final confrontation was scheduled to take place at the foot of the ultimate symbol of American idealism, where history's precious secret was hidden in plain sight. We have achieved the following. Resolved the cipher. The Statue of Liberty is the hidden financial collateral for the revolution, made of copper and nickel ore. Clarified the threat. The cartographer plans a temporal collapse at the statue's base to erase the proof of America's solvency. Mobilize the team. Eleanor uses her modern contacts, the press, while Finch and Abigail, the 18th century experts, secure the artifacts and transport. The sun was barely staining the eastern sky when a small, unmarked tugboat, borrowed under highly irregular circumstances thanks to Abigail's knowledge of discreet 18th century dock signaling, churned its way toward Liberty Island. Eleanor, her shoulder tightly bandaged, stood at the stern with a pair of borrowed binoculars, the magnificent copper figure of Lady Liberty growing larger with every wave. "He's there," she confirmed, lowering the glasses. "At the very top of the pedestal, near the maintenance hatch. There's a faint purple light, the chronometer's unstable charge." Finch, working frantically by the tug's engine light, had succeeded in turning the damaged continental chronometer key into a crude temporal disruptor. "The key is now a weapon of last resort," Finch explained, the metal still smoking faintly. "If inserted into the chronometer's casing, it won't program the device. It will overload the copper capacitor, neutralizing the temporal field, but potentially causing a localized physical shock wave. It's the only way to stop the collapse." Abigail, the 18th century courier, was the key to their infiltration. Her fluency in military protocols, even those a century old, allowed them to bypass the lone night watchman with a quick, expertly fabricated story about a sanitation emergency. The ascent to the pedestal. The cartographer had chosen his final battlefield with cold precision. The pedestal, a massive, imposing structure of granite and concrete, represented the enduring political foundation of the nation, while the copper statue above held the hidden financial truth. They found the main entrance hatch forced open. Inside, the echoing silence was broken only by the rhythmic, unnerving hum of the unstable temporal field. Finch led the way, relying on his knowledge of architecture, while Abigail covered their six, her flintlock pistol oddly silent but ready. Eleanor, relying on her ability to spot minute deviations, found the path the cartographer had taken. Tiny scorch marks on the steps, the faint metallic scent of the chronometer's unique alloy. They emerged onto the exterior balcony of the pedestal, a dizzying height that offered a panoramic view of the awakened city. There, right near the sealed maintenance door leading into the statue itself, was the cartographer. He was dressed not in a suit, but in a strange insulated leather harness, and was attaching the final wires of the broken chronometer to a massive grounding rod driven deep into the pedestal's granite. The chronometer, bathed in unstable purple energy, pulsed violently. A rather dramatic stage for a simple engineering correction. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Vance? "It's not a correction, it's a corruption," Eleanor shouted, stepping onto the balcony. "The copper is the collateral. You intend to destroy the physical proof of the revolution's solvency." The cartographer finally turned, his face etched with strain from wrestling with the unstable power. "Collateral is debt, Miss Vance, and debt breeds chaos. My masters, the consortium, and their predecessors thrive on order. This statue is a false beacon. By initiating a temporal collapse here, I vaporize the historical proof of the ore. The financial records of the 1776 loan stand alone, unpaid and illegitimate. The whole nation becomes a fraud, ripe for restructuring under absolute capital control." He lifted a small mechanical trigger switch. "The charge is critical. I only need to complete the circuit."
A duel in 3 eras. The confrontation fractured instantly into 3 parallel duels. Finch versus the mechanism. The calculation. Finch raced toward the chronometer, shouting at the cartographer. "The mathematics is unsound. The copper structure is too vast. An uncontrolled temporal field will not cause a clean collapse. It will cause a temporal shrapnel event. It will scatter fragments of history indiscriminately across the city." Abigail versus the enforcer. The distraction. Just as the cartographer prepared to throw the switch, the main door to the balcony burst open. Mick, the anchor O'Malley, and 2 other heavy-set men from Tammany Hall appeared, pistols drawn. They weren't here to help the cartographer. They were here to seize the chronometer for Thorne. "The game's over, Professor," O'Malley roared. "The boss wants the clock, whole or broken." Abigail, the 18th century courier, immediately engaged the Tammany men in a deadly close-quarters gunfight, her flintlock surprisingly effective at close range. Eleanor versus the cartographer. The confrontation. With O'Malley distracting the cartographer's line of sight, Eleanor sprinted the final few feet, clutching the improvised temporal disruptor key. "You may control time, but you failed to account for human variables," Eleanor yelled. She threw herself at the grounding rod, forcing the cartographer to turn his attention to her. He lunged, abandoning the trigger switch, trying to wrestle the key away. "You are an imperfection, Miss Vance, a detail I should have erased at the ball." They struggled violently on the granite pedestal, the wind whipping around them. The cartographer was stronger, but Eleanor's desperation gave her a momentary advantage. As he grabbed her arm, she used her typesetter's precision one last time. Instead of hitting the chronometer's casing, she slammed the key directly into the temporal trigger switch in his hand. The resulting spark was instant and devastating. The echo of order. The chronometer roared, releasing its trapped, unstable energy. It did not implode or collapse the timeline. Instead, the overload created an intense directional temporal echo, a blinding flash of light and sound that instantly rendered everyone unconscious. When Eleanor came to moments later, the light was fading, and the only sound was the wind. The chronometer was reduced to slag, a smoking ruin of obsidian alloy fused to the granite. The cartographer was gone. The sheer feedback energy had vaporized his harness, and perhaps his very presence, leaving only a faint scorch mark in the shape of a man. O'Malley and his men were equally gone, the shockwave having thrown them clear of the pedestal, presumably into the bay.
Eleanor crawled over to where Finch lay dazed but alive. The continental chronometer key was still in her hand, severely burned but intact. She looked toward the statue. The copper skin was fine. The temporal collapse had been prevented, but the echo had happened. Finch stirred, his eyes wide. "Miss Vance, the timeline. What happened?" "The key, when it overloaded the trigger, it didn't neutralize the field. It sent the stored power backward," Finch stammered, pointing to the base of the statue's torch. Just beneath the torch's flame, now visible to them on the immense copper sheet, was a new inscription. A single, hairline crack in the metal, subtly etched into the vast copper. It was an unmistakable message, visible only to those who knew what to look for. The golden ratio, the cartographer's cipher. The echo wasn't destructive. It was instructive. By overloading the machine, you didn't erase his history. You sent his final, ultimate calculation into the past, embedding the cipher directly into the collateral itself. He has guaranteed that the next person who tries to find the secret of the copper statue will start with his calculation. They had won the battle, saving the 1888 timeline, but they had lost the war against the cartographer's methodology. He was gone, but his ultimate subtle mark was now a permanent part of the statue's history. Eleanor looked out at Manhattan, no longer a chaotic heart of brick and possibility, but a complex tapestry of time and money, perpetually challenged. Abigail, the 18th century courier, was also alive, standing near the balcony edge, looking across the river. "I am a century from my home. General Washington's cipher is safe, but my time is lost." Finch, with a wry, sudden smile, took Abigail's hand. "Not entirely lost, Miss Wentworth. You are a variable that the 19th century needs, and I, as a horologist, know a great deal about adapting to a new chronological environment." Eleanor watched them, the scholar and the soldier, recognizing the birth of a new secret alliance, the future protectors of America's fragile temporal history. She held the smoking key. The Gilded Hour Consortium was shaken by the media scandal she'd created, and the threat of the cartographer was, for now, neutralized. But the existence of the Manhattan chronometer meant that the concept of time travel and historical engineering was real. The city's great clock had been shattered, but its hands, Eleanor, Finch, and now Abigail, remained. Their mission had only just begun. The task was no longer to find a stolen artifact, but to guard a broken reality. Epilogue: The Watchers of the Grid. A week later, Eleanor Vance, newly promoted to a specialized, unlisted position at Penhaligon Press, moved into a small, quiet apartment near Gramercy Park. Her office, tucked away behind a facade of harmless printing supplies, became the headquarters for the new Committee for Temporal Integrity. Abigail, adapting quickly to 1888, used her training as a courier to gather intelligence on the still-operating elements of the consortium. Finch, meanwhile, began the painstaking work of trying to repair the key and locate any remaining fragments of the chronometer. The New York World published a scathing front-page exposé on Silas Thorne's alleged involvement in the illegal trade of Revolutionary War artifacts, forcing the politician into temporary seclusion. The Gilded Hour was crippled, but not defeated. The greatest mystery remained the cartographer's fate. Was he truly gone, or was his temporal shrapnel comment a warning? One rainy afternoon, Finch received a small wooden box delivered by an anonymous street urchin. Inside was a single object, a perfect, functional, gold-plated pocket watch.
Attached to the chain was a minute slip of paper with a final message written in the cartographer's chillingly precise hand. The calculation is complete. The future will proceed on my terms. Every great city, Miss Vance, requires a chronometer, but New York will always need a cartographer. He was not vaporized. He had achieved his ultimate goal, escaping the current timeline and becoming an omnipresent, invisible force, an engineer who could correct the history of the entire world, not just a single city. Eleanor held the watch, its second hand ticking with uncanny regularity. She now understood her true place. She wasn't just guarding the past, she was preparing for the future. Her life, bound to the secret history of America, had just begun. Spring 1893. The Committee for Temporal Integrity, Headquarters, Gramercy Park, New York. The headquarters of the newly formed committee was the discreet, soundproofed basement of Finch's brownstone. Eleanor Vance, now the operational leader, was no longer a typesetter, but an intelligence officer. Abigail Wentworth, having traded her 18th century homespun for a discreet modern suit, was the committee's historical analyst and field operative. Professor Finch remained the central academic authority, hunched over his bench, trying to glean secrets from the fused fragments of the chronometer. "The problem is not the bomb, Miss Vance, but the whisper," Finch declared, pushing his spectacles up his nose. He was studying a contemporary New York Times article reporting on the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the spectacular White City. Eleanor was tracking anomalies across major American newspapers. "The whisper is getting louder, Professor. For the past 6 months, every article about the exposition, every financial projection, every technological promise has an undercurrent of unshakable certainty. It's too neat, too perfect." The 1893 exposition, meant to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, was historically fraught with setbacks, delays, and political infighting. Yet the current media coverage described a seamless, financially foolproof, and technologically flawless event. "The cartographer's hand," Abigail stated, her voice clipped with certainty. "He learned that the future is not altered with a single blow, but with 1,000 tiny, precise adjustments. He's fine-tuning the American narrative of inevitable dominance." The cartographer, having embedded his cipher into the Statue of Liberty's copper, was now subtly influencing the next great display of American power, the Exposition, where technological giants like Edison and Westinghouse would battle for control of the nation's electrical future. Finch tapped the article. "The Chicago event is dominated by a sudden total faith in alternating current technology, spearheaded by the Westinghouse Company. Historically, this was a fierce, unpredictable war against Edison's direct current. But now, the papers speak of AC's complete, unchallenged victory, months before the fair even opens. It is an engineered outcome." The cartographer, a technician of efficiency and precision, favored AC power for its wide-reaching, standardized grid, a perfect framework for centralized control. "He is preparing the grid for the ultimate takeover," Eleanor concluded, standing up. "If he establishes the dominance of a single uniform power source, he establishes the perfect infrastructure for future manipulation. The chronometer is gone, but the pocket watch he left is still ticking." Eleanor retrieved the cartographer's pocket watch from a shielded glass case. It wasn't just a clock. It was a miniature, high-precision temporal transceiver.
"The watch tracks his movements," Finch confirmed. "The hands are still, but the internal vibration, the frequency, shifts. For the last week, that frequency has stabilized, pointing west. It is tethered to Chicago." Eleanor and Abigail booked passage on a first-class Pullman car, trading the gas-lit grime of New York for the roaring ambition of the Transcontinental Railway. The journey itself was a study in 19th century America. Boundless space, ruthless capital, and a terrifying speed toward the future. Their objective in Chicago? Find the point of maximum temporal stress at the exposition, the specific location where the cartographer had manipulated the outcome of the Currents War. Abigail, navigating the train with the effortless command of a seasoned operative, noted the settled changes in the local history. The passengers here, bankers, engineers, politicians, they speak of the exposition not as a marvel, but as an investment certainty. The risk has been scrubbed clean. This confidence is unnatural. They arrived in Chicago, a city recently rebuilt from the Great Fire and now entirely consumed by the exposition. The White City was a dazzling, ephemeral creation of plaster and steel on the shores of Lake Michigan, a vision of a perfect, electrified future. The cartographer's watch began to vibrate faster as they approached the fairgrounds, confirming their target. Their first stop was the Electricity Building, the epicenter of the Currents War. The air crackled with power and the hum of thousands of newly installed light bulbs. The building was an astonishing spectacle of light, demonstrating the raw power of alternating current. "Too broad," Eleanor whispered, the cartographer's watch vibrating violently in her hand. "The indelication isn't the whole building, it's a single vital component." Abigail, ever the historical specialist, pointed to a plaque detailing the grand prize of the exposition, a massive, customized Westinghouse AC generator, the largest built to date, which provided all the power for the White City. The generator is the heart of the White City's power. If the cartographer needed to embed a permanent change in the narrative of power, he would target the machine's inception. The key to the coil. They managed to gain access to the secure area housing the generator, posing as journalists specializing in industrial design. The Westinghouse generator was a colossal, humming beast of copper and iron. Finch's fragmented analysis of the chronometer had revealed one critical truth. The cartographer always worked with resonant materials. Eleanor and Abigail circled the massive machine. The watch's vibration was deafening now, focused on a small, unobtrusive section of the main commutator coil, the heart of the AC production. "There," Eleanor pointed, her heart pounding. The copper coil was pristine, save for a single minute piece of non-copper metal embedded deep in the winding. It looked like a tiny sliver of nickel steel alloy, the same alloy used in the Statue of Liberty's frame. It was an impedance shunt, a device designed to absorb and stabilize all electrical resistance, ensuring the generator's flawless performance and eliminating the risk of failure that plagued early AC technology. It had been surgically placed within the coil, guaranteeing the inevitable victory of AC power at the exposition. He didn't need the whole chronometer, Finch had predicted in a telegram. He needed only a single, perfectly calibrated temporal fragment, a piece of the chronometer's casing, to stabilize the technology.
The cartographer hadn't simply created a flawless exposition. He had, through the impedance shunt, erased the historical uncertainty of the Currents War, thereby cementing the future of a centralized, uniform power grid for the next century. "If we leave it," Eleanor said, "the entire history of American power becomes a monopoly. The narrative of competition is erased. And if we remove it," Abigail countered, flintlock in hand, "we risk a catastrophic power failure in the White City and possibly a major temporal backlash." Eleanor took a deep breath. She retrieved a specialized, insulated toolkit Finch had prepared. "We don't remove it, Abigail. We detune it." The cartographer's return. As Eleanor began the delicate, high-voltage operation to disrupt the shunt's perfect frequency, a familiar, smooth voice echoed from the shadowed corner of the engine room. A predictable, yet charmingly ineffective response, Miss Vance. The cartographer stepped out. He wore the same charcoal suit, but his pale eyes held a new, chilling confidence. He was not tied to the watch. He was the watch. The watch brought me here. The shunt is the perfect calculation. It ensures order. You cling to chaos, he stated, walking toward them. I cling to free will, cartographer, Eleanor retorted, working the tools with desperate speed, and I refuse your engineered future. Then you misunderstand the nature of progress. Look around, Miss Vance. This city, this age, it is all built on my calculations. The time for uncertainty is over. He moved to intercept her, but Abigail, the 18th century soldier, stepped forward, pistol drawn. You speak of certainty, Abigail said, her voice hard, but you fail to account for the unpredictable force of a single woman determined to finish her mission regardless of the century. The cartographer, seeing the antique weapon, merely scoffed. A projectile based on combustion? Primitive. Abigail didn't fire. Instead, she threw the heavy flintlock pistol not at him, but at the ceiling, shattering a highly sensitive voltage regulator. The generator's hum instantly became a guttural, chaotic whine. The lights in the massive hall began to flicker violently. The uncertainty the cartographer had worked so hard to eliminate was rushing back into the system. Eleanor seized the opportunity. With a final, precise movement, she struck the impedance shunt, cracking the nickel-steel alloy. The generator screamed. A massive wave of destabilized energy, a temporal wave mixed with raw current, erupted from the coil, washing over the engine room. The lights went out completely, plunging the electricity building into darkness and throwing both Abigail and Eleanor to the floor. When the chaos subsided, the generator was silent. The white city had gone dark. The cartographer was gone, having slipped away in the electrical blackout, but the impedance shunt was cracked, its perfection ruined. The certainty was gone. The currents war would now play out as it was always meant to, a messy, uncertain, but ultimately fair competition. Eleanor stood up in the sudden darkness, the cartographer's watch now vibrating gently in her pocket, pointing south. "He's running again," she said, her voice strained. "And the next part of his calculation is already in place." Abigail, reloading her pistol, looked out the window at the now dark exposition. Where does a man who worships absolute order go when his beautiful, fragile structure is shattered? Eleanor checked the watch's frequency against Finch's log. "It's tethered to a major financial panic," she said. "To the coal fields of Pennsylvania, the panic of 1893. The Committee for Temporal Integrity had secured the technological timeline, but the next target was the American economy itself. We have achieved the following: investigated the anomaly, confirmed the cartographer's manipulation of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition using an impedance shunt to guarantee the victory of AC power. Resolved the conflict. Eleanor and Abigail successfully detuned the shunt, returning historical uncertainty and disrupting the cartographer's plan. Set the next course. The cartographer's watch points to the coal fields of Pennsylvania and the panic of 1893, indicating his next target is the American financial and labor system. Would you like the next chapter to focus on the high-stakes confrontation in the coal fields of Pennsylvania involving labor disputes and industrial tycoons?
Autumn, 1893. Hazleton Coal Region, Pennsylvania. The economic depression known as the Panic of 1893 was tearing the nation apart.
Banks were failing, railroads were collapsing, and nowhere was the tension more volatile than in the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, where desperate immigrant miners were striking against ruthless industrial barons. Eleanor and Abigail arrived in Hazleton region under the cover of the mounting chaos. The landscape was brutal. Piles of black slate scarring the hills, and the air thick with coal dust and a palpable fear of violence. The cartographer's watch vibrated with a sickening, rapid pulse, confirming the epicenter of the anomaly was the deepest mine shaft of the Lehigh Valley Coal Company. Professor Finch, communicating via coded telegrams, provided the historical context. The Panic of 1893 deepened the existing labor strife. The cartographer isn't just targeting the mines, he's targeting the narrative of the American worker. His goal is to provoke a collapse so severe that the government is forced to enter in, not to aid the workers, but to nationalize the mines under the control of the consortium's proxies. The cartographer, a purist of order, detested the messy, unpredictable force of organized labor. He sought to replace it with a controlled, centralized industrial complex. The hidden ledger. Eleanor and Abigail, posing as journalists investigating the working conditions, secured access to the mining camp. Abigail's familiarity with the hardships of the poor from the 18th century gave her an easy rapport with the immigrant families. They learned quickly that the true source of the current tension wasn't just wages, but the company's sudden, inexplicable refusal to release a specific, ancient land deed that promised miners perpetual water rights to the deep shafts. Without that deed, the miners can't legally contest the company's seizure of the pumps, a young Irish miner named Declan explained bitterly. They'll flood the lower shafts to break the strike, and hundreds will lose their jobs and their homes. The deed, signed in 1840, was a forgotten piece of history, but a crucial piece of legal temporal leverage. The deed is the target, Eleanor realized, her gaze sweeping the makeshift camp. The cartographer is trying to destroy the legal basis of the workers' leverage, thereby guaranteeing the corporate takeover. The cartographer's watch pointed them to the old, disused company superintendent's office, a flimsy wooden structure guarded by 3 brutish armed company guards. Under the cover of a freezing downpour, Abigail, using her 18th century stealth tactics, created a diversion. She used a small amount of black powder, salvaged from her flintlock's ammunition, to trigger a localized flare-up in an abandoned slag heap, drawing the guards away with shouts of fire. Eleanor slipped into the superintendent's office. Inside, the watch's vibration was deafening. The land deed was locked inside an iron safe. The cartographer had been here, but his work was incomplete. Affixed to the safe door was a small, almost invisible piece of metal, a sliver of the obsidian chronometer alloy, acting as a temporal stasis field. It didn't prevent opening the safe, but it was freezing the molecular decay of the deed itself, ensuring that the historical document remained perfectly preserved until the precise moment the cartographer chose to incinerate it. The cartographer, unable to destroy the deed on site, had created a temporal time bomb. The trap in the shaft. Eleanor worked quickly, using a miniature clock key and acid to compromise the safe's lock. She pulled out the ancient rolled parchment, the key to the miner's rights. But the moment she touched it, a voice echoed from the shadows of the office. Such predictable sentiment, Miss Vance, always saving the small detail. Do you truly believe a piece of paper can halt the inevitable march of industrial necessity? The cartographer emerged, clean and unbothered by the coal dust. He didn't carry the chronometer. He carried a simple, elegant brass telegraph key attached to a portable battery. The deed is leverage, not power, he explained, a flicker of impatience in his eyes.
My true target is the national credit. The panic of '93 is merely a ripple. My telegraph is connected to the Central Western Union lines. When I send my message, I will be leveraging the fear generated by the strike and the potential mine collapse to execute a precise, coordinated series of short cells that will utterly destroy the bond holdings of the last independent banks in New York. He pointed toward a small mineshaft entrance behind his position. The deed is yours, but the shaft is rigged. The moment I send this signal, I trigger a small localized seismic charge, causing a partial collapse. The resulting fear will be the final ingredient I need to execute my financial correction. Eleanor realized the horrifying truth. The cartographer was using the strike, the impending collapse, and the legal dispute as emotional and physical fuel for his electronic financial attack. "You create a crisis so you can profit from the ruins," Eleanor accused, gripping the deed. "I create an ordered solution," he corrected. "Out of the inevitable chaos, I provide the necessary hierarchy. Now, surrender the deed. It is the final link in the chain of legitimacy I seek to break." The unpredictable force. Before Eleanor could move, the door to the office burst open. Declan, the Irish miner, appeared, having seen Eleanor enter the office. He carried a heavy, crude pickaxe. "You'll not be hurtin' the lady," Declan roared, fueled by desperation and righteous anger, and charged the cartographer. The cartographer, contemptuous of the primitive physical threat, didn't flinch. He simply threw the brass telegraph key, not at the miner, but at the temporal stasis field attached to the safe. The impact caused the sliver of chronometer alloy to emit a blinding localized flash. Declan stumbled, disoriented by the temporal discharge, giving the cartographer the opening he needed. He seized Eleanor's arm, but she was ready. She slammed the cartographer's watch, the tracking device, hard against the brass key still lying on the floor. The watch screamed. The localized temporal field created by the alloy sliver and the watch's frequency intensified violently. The air around the cartographer began to ripple, pulling at his clothing. "You fool!" he shrieked, letting go of Eleanor and stumbling back. "You're creating a temporal vacuum!" The cartographer, unwilling to be sucked into his own temporal anomaly, pulled back from the collapsing field just as Abigail, having secured the area outside, burst in with her pistol. She didn't hesitate. She fired the flintlock into the small mineshaft entrance, not at the cartographer, but at the rigged seismic charge. The explosion was immediate and contained, a localized cave-in that sealed the mineshaft entrance, trapping the planned collapse and the threat of the financial signal. The cartographer, seeing his final leverage point, the threat of the mine collapse sealed off, gave Eleanor a look of pure, cold hatred. "You postpone the inevitable, but the market never forgets a correction." He vanished, not by temporal distortion, but through a hidden access tunnel beneath the safe, leaving Eleanor and Abigail with the stunned miner and the now shattered sliver of chronometer alloy. Eleanor handed the deed to Declan. "The water rights are yours. Get this to a lawyer, now!" The confrontation was over. The financial panic would continue, but the cartographer's deliberate final blow to the American financial structure had been averted. They had saved the integrity of the market. However, the cartographer's departure left one chilling clue. He had abandoned his primary weapon, the telegraph key. It was not a tool of the past, but a symbol of the future. Finch's next telegram arrived an hour later. The watch's frequency is now focused on Washington, D.C., 1903. The cartographer has transitioned from controlling capital and industry to controlling law and governance. The telegraph key is the symbol. He is targeting the infrastructure of American justice. The game was changing. The battlefield was shifting from the economy to the capital. We have achieved the following: resolved the conflict. The cartographer's financial attack during the Panic of 1893 was thwarted by securing the land deed and sealing the rigged mine shaft. Analyzed the clues. The cartographer abandoned his telegraph key, signaling a shift of focus from financial markets to political and legal infrastructure. Set the next course. The Watch and Finch's research point to Washington, D.C., 1903, and a plot centered around American law and governance.
The time is precisely 12:30 p.m. The sound that ripped through the north end of Boston was described by witnesses as a low, continuous rumble, followed by a thunderous, ripping roar, like the sound of a huge elevated train car derailing or a machine gun spitting 1,000 rounds. It was the sound of over 700 tons of steel failing simultaneously. The enormous tank on Commercial Street ruptured. The collapse was instantaneous and catastrophic. The 2-million-gallon wave of molasses, 26 million pounds of sticky, viscous liquid, was released with the force of an exploding bomb. It wasn't a gentle pour, it was a detonation. The resulting wave was estimated to be 25 feet high at its peak, and for a short, terrifying moment, it traveled at an estimated 35 miles per hour. This was not water. This was an unstoppable, dense, flowing disaster. The speed of the wave was so great that witnesses said the sound of the wave preceded the wave itself. The immediate impact was localized but absolute. Directly across the street, Engine House 31 of the Boston Fire Department was instantly overwhelmed. The enormous wall of molasses smashed into the brick building, shattering the walls and carrying the entire structure off its foundation. The firefighters inside, eating their lunch, were trapped, buried, and drowned almost instantly. The elevated train structure, a massive steel framework supporting the Boston Elevated Railway, was next. The wave hit the supporting pillars with such force that it temporarily lifted a streetcar off its tracks. The physics of the disaster were unique. Molasses, being 5 times denser than water, carried an unbelievable mass and kinetic energy. Anything in its path was not merely swept away, it was pulverized. The wave ripped houses off their foundations, snapped telephone poles like matchsticks, and crushed horses and wagons beneath its syrupy mass. The wave surged inland, engulfing the maze of narrow, winding streets of the North End. It poured into the basement apartments and tenements where families were gathered. The initial destructive force lasted mere seconds, but the true terror was the aftermath. As the molasses cooled rapidly in the winter air, it became thick, slow-moving, and incredibly adhesive. It began to set, turning the disaster zone into a sticky, inescapable trap. People caught in the initial rush were not just hit, they were pinned, trapped, and slowly suffocated by the heavy, suffocating mass. Survivors later recounted the terrifying experience of being engulfed. They described the sensation as being caught in a swirling vortex of tar and syrup, where every movement to escape only pulled them deeper into the clinging substance. The weight of the molasses was crushing, making it impossible to breathe or move one's limbs. The most horrific discovery was that the deep pools of molasses looked deceivingly calm on the surface, but underneath, the currents were strong enough to drag victims down to the bottom, where they were completely submerged and drowned in the dark liquid. Within minutes, the North End was transformed into a bizarre post-apocalyptic landscape. Streets were rendered impassable by a layer of thick, dark syrup that was often 3 to 4 feet deep. The elevated railway structure was stained black up to the level of the tracks. The dense, sweet odor, once a curiosity, was now a powerful, sickly stench of death and fermentation that hung over the city. The community reaction was immediate. Neighbors, many of them immigrants who relied on local knowledge and community bonds, rushed to the disaster zone. But the rescue effort itself was fraught with peril. The rescuers found themselves wading through molasses that reached their hips, making every step an exhausting struggle. The viscosity of the molasses made it impossible to see victims trapped below the surface. They had to rely on hearing, faint cries and struggling sounds to locate the buried. The paradox of the disaster was now fully visible. The substance that made the city smell sweet was now the killer. The wave, moving at the speed of a freight train, had vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a sticky, immovable graveyard.
The final leverage. Eleanor knew they couldn't fight the military police. She had to use her last, most potent form of leverage, temporal manipulation of perception. "Cartographer," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze, "you speak of mathematical inevitability, but you made one final, crucial error in your calculation." She reached into her bag and pulled out the shattered, half-melted Continental chronometer key, the disruptor weapon from the Brooklyn Bridge. "This key is now a temporal resonance tuner," she announced, holding it up. "It won't stop your anchor from degrading the concrete, but I can use it to force the anchor to broadcast one final, uncontrolled, and hyper-localized temporal echo." The cartographer stopped, his eyes widening with genuine alarm. "What echo?" "The echo of the Panama Revolution. The moment the U.S. engineered Panama's secession from Colombia in 1903 to secure the canal rights. If I forced your anchor to broadcast the raw, unstable truth of that moment, the bribes, the gunboats, the questionable legality, it won't destroy the canal, but it will shatter the political legitimacy of the entire canal zone, sparking an immediate international crisis and rendering the zone militarily indefensible." The cartographer had created a massive engineering project, but Eleanor was threatening to destroy the political foundation that gave him control over it. "You would commit political suicide for your nation?" he hissed. "It's not suicide. It's rebalancing the temporal scales," Eleanor countered. "If the canal must fail, it will fail due to political and moral decay, not a structural one. Choose, cartographer. Let the collapse proceed in September, or I fracture the temporal timeline right now, giving the world immediate justification to seize the zone." The cartographer's controlled demeanor finally broke. He needed the canal zone's stability to execute his long-term global plan. The sudden chaotic exposure of the 1903 political secrets would dismantle his entire structure of control. "Release them," the cartographer ordered the military police, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "They are part of my inspection team, an unscheduled test." As the military police looked confusedly at the cartographer, Eleanor and Abigail moved swiftly. Abigail, using a piece of wire from her suit, slipped it into a massive maintenance lever, locking the culvert door behind the cartographer and his team. "Now, Professor, the key," Eleanor commanded. Finch rushed to the temporal vibrational anchor. He saw the access port. He knew they only had seconds before the cartographer found a way out. "It has to be the most unstable frequency," Finch yelled, plunging the damaged chronometer key into the port. The anchor shrieked, the purple light intensified, and the massive concrete walls of the lock complex began to vibrate violently. A high-pitched metallic whine that tasted of ozone and salt filled the air. Eleanor and Abigail threw themselves clear as the anchor overloaded. It exploded in a localized storm of temporal energy, showering the culvert with dust and shattered bronze. The structural integrity of the concrete was safe, but the machine that sustained the failure was neutralized. The cartographer, having escaped the locked culvert, stood on the opposite side of the massive chamber, his white uniform covered in dust. He looked at the smoking wreckage, then at Eleanor. "You have won the battle for the waterway, Miss Vance," he conceded, his voice resigned, yet utterly certain. "But you have yet to understand my true victory. The schism has already happened." He pulled out a single, heavily circulated American nickel. "Look closely at the date. I am not targeting the future, Miss Vance. I have been correcting the past all along." The date stamped on the nickel was not the expected 1914. It was 1921. "The world you save," the cartographer stated, before vanishing into a nearby steam pipe network, "is 7 years in the future of where it should be. The schism is the great acceleration. The chaos you embrace has been mathematically optimized. You think you saved the world. You simply sped it up to my deadline." Eleanor stared at the nickel, the weight of the impossible date settling heavily upon her. The cartographer had succeeded, not by changing an event, but by compressing the timeline, forcing the Gilded Age into the threshold of the modern age 7 years ahead of schedule, ensuring that the ensuing chaos would favor his ordered structures. The confrontation was over, but the final, greatest anomaly, a compressed modern world, had begun.
August 1914, chronological reality, 1921. New York City, USA. The return to New York was a dizzying journey through a world that had aged 7 years in an instant. Eleanor, Finch, and Abigail stepped off the ferry and onto the docks of Manhattan, but the familiar hustle of 1914 was gone, replaced by the roaring chaos of what felt like a premature jazz age. The changes were immediate and profound. Architecture. The skyline had exploded. Towering skyscrapers of steel and glass dominated lower Manhattan, built with a reckless speed that defied 1914's construction methods. The Woolworth Building, a wonder in 1914, was now merely one spire among dozens. Transportation. The streets were choked not with horses and early automobiles, but with streamlined, efficient motor cars. Elevated trains, the L, ran faster, electrified lines. The air thrummed with the sound of early, heavy aeroplanes. Culture. Women wore shorter dresses and smoked openly. The atmosphere was one of breathless consumerist excess. The roaring 20s had arrived ahead of schedule, fueled by the cartographer's accelerated timeline. "The nickel was accurate," Finch murmured, adjusting his glasses and looking utterly bewildered by the speed of it all. "He didn't change history, Miss Vance. He compressed it. The natural pace of invention, industry, and social change, 7 years of it, was forcibly collapsed into a moment. He has given the consortium the chaotic, high-speed environment they thrive in." Abigail, the 18th century courier, ironically adapted the fastest. The patterns are the same, Professor, only the noise is louder. This speed is a mask. Where there is speed, there is reckless vulnerability. The cartographer's masterpiece. The headquarters at Gramercy Park was locked and dusty. The committee found a massive stack of unopened mail and a sheaf of financial reports dated 1921 that confirmed the full scope of the acceleration. Industrial consolidation. The Northern Securities Trust, which had to be broken up by law, was operating under a new, even larger holding company, testament to the cartographer's delayed success. Technological monopoly. The alternating current grid, stabilized by the shunt, which had operated flawlessly for 7 years before they cracked it, was now the undisputed, standardized power source for the entire eastern seaboard. Political corruption. The accelerated political cycle installed the most amenable pro-business administration in Washington, D.C., confirming the cartographer's victory in the legal sphere. He didn't want to stop the future, he wanted to control the speed and direction of its arrival, Eleanor concluded, running her hand over the sleek modern phone in the office. He's built his perfect ordered world on chaos, giving his masters an unassailable head start. The cartographer's watch was silent. The final temporal manipulation was complete. The tool was inert. He stopped moving in time, Finch realized. He is no longer correcting the past or speeding up the present. He has retired. He is living in his final, perfected moment. The key now lay in the nickel itself, the temporal tuning fork the cartographer had left behind. Finch examined the coin, noting that the metal felt subtly different. It was resonating with the residual chronometer alloy. This nickel is his last anchor. It pinpoints the exact physical location where he decided to stop, his temporal sanctuary. The final coordinate. Finch performed a final desperate calculation using the nickel's residual frequency against the established coordinates of the old, unaccelerated timeline, 1914. The nickel's alloy contained trace elements from all his previous targets, the statue's copper, the Brooklyn Bridge's steel, the Supreme Court's granite. The frequency matched a very specific, unique architectural landmark in the new 1921 New York. The result of the calculation was chillingly familiar, yet utterly transformed. The old Croton Reservoir demolition site. Times Square, Eleanor breathed. In 1914, this was the nascent theater district. In 1921, thanks to the cartographer's acceleration, it was the blinding, chaotic nexus of American modernity. The old reservoir was gone, replaced by a dense concentration of theaters, towers, and the brand-new electrified heart of the consortium's media empire, a massive, clock-faced tower dedicated to mass communication and entertainment. He's not living underground, Finch observed. He has built his throne atop the very spot where our journey began. The heart of the chaos he created is his perfect, final order. He's waiting for us, Eleanor said, a cold certainty settling in her heart. He wants to witness the end of the only variables he couldn't calculate. Us.
The uncalculated variable. Eleanor formulated the final, desperate plan. They had no temporal devices left, only the nickel, Abigail's revolutionary-era knowledge of infiltration and sabotage, and Finch's command of physics. He built a world based on speed, efficiency, and mathematics, Eleanor stated. We will attack it with what he eliminated, disorder and uncalculated human action. Their final target, the Consortium Media Tower in Times Square, 1921. The plan was simple. Abigail, the chaos factor. Utilize her 18th century knowledge of urban sabotage, non-lethal, highly visible disruption, to create a citywide power surge and distraction in the hypersensitive 1921 electrical grid. Finch, the counter-frequency. Use the temporal nickel to create a focused counter-frequency, forcing a localized brief temporal slowdown to disorient the cartographer. Eleanor, The final confrontation. Face the cartographer alone at the top of the tower, armed only with her absolute knowledge of his methods and the truth of the history he sought to destroy. The three agents of the Committee for Temporal Integrity prepared for their final irreversible move against the man who had stolen 7 years of the world's life. Midnight, the Consortium Media Tower, Times Square, 1921. Times Square was a blinding spectacle of electric light and advertising, a monument to the cartographer's engineered consumerist future. The massive clock face atop the tower shone down on the bustling late-night crowds. Abigail, moving with the practiced stealth of a revolutionary spy, secured her position beneath the main power nexus feeding the tower. She used a precisely calibrated disruption, a combination of copper wire and salt water, old world methods against new world power, to create a rapid series of surging brownouts across the electrical grid. The lights of Times Square flickered wildly. The chaos of the city was suddenly visible beneath its polished electric veneer. The slowdown. As the power failed intermittently, Eleanor and Finch ascended the final narrow ladder leading to the observation deck and clock mechanism at the top of the tower. They found the cartographer waiting inside the massive glass-enclosed clock chamber. He was standing beside the main gear train, dressed in a simple charcoal suit, looking out at his ordered, accelerated city. The chamber was silent, save for the relentless clack-clack of the giant minute hand. "The theatrics are unnecessary, Professor," Eleanor stated, not bothering to turn. "And the attempt to destabilize the grid is predictably chaotic." Finch ignored him. He was setting up a makeshift apparatus, a copper wire coil connected to the temporal nickel near the gear. "He needs to be disoriented, Eleanor. The cartographer exists on his own hyper-accelerated frequency. I'm going to use the nickel to force a microburst of temporal resistance, a sudden, localized temporal slowdown. It should feel like he's wading through mud." Finch threw the switch. A low, vibrating hum filled the chamber. The cartographer visibly stiffened. The rapid clack-clack of the minute hand slowed, distorting into a wet, drawn-out clack, clack. The movement of time itself in the chamber became sluggish. The cartographer turned, his movements delayed, his eyes burning with outrage. "You cling to the old speed. You reject efficiency." Eleanor stepped forward, confronting the man who had defined her life for the past 7 years, even the 7 years she hadn't lived. "You speak of order, cartographer, but your world is a lie. It's built on a foundation of theft, deceit, and engineered fraud. You stole 7 years of life, progress, and change. You erased the possibility of a different, better future." The cartographer, fighting the temporal drag, raised his hand toward a control panel on the massive deer train, the final kill switch for the accelerated timeline. "The great lie, Miss Vance, is choice," he struggled to articulate, his words painfully slow. "You, the typesetter, were a flaw I should have corrected. But I will correct your influence now." He intended to lock the temporal frequency of 1921 permanently, sealing off the possibility of a return to the natural timeline. Eleanor knew she couldn't outfight him, and the slowdown was agonizingly slow. She made her final, most personal move. She focused not on the machine, but on the man. "The truth is, cartographer," Eleanor said, forcing her words to cut through the drag, You are not an engineer. You are a coward. You didn't correct history, you fled it. The reason you need this perfect world is because you were once a variable yourself, an insignificant detail that history ignored. She had pieced together his history from the documents he sought to destroy. The forgotten patent applications, the failed early business ventures, the humiliating public failures in the 1880s, all erased by the speed of his own acceleration. You were a man who failed in the chaotic competition of the Gilded Age, and you accelerated time to erase the years of your own weakness. The words struck the cartographer with more force than any temporal blast. His eyes widened, the hatred replaced with raw, exposed humiliation. His temporal resistance faltered. Eleanor seized the moment. She didn't touch the controls. She did the one thing that was entirely outside his calculation. She broke the pattern. She slammed the temporal nickel, the coin bearing his accelerated date, down on the massive brass pendulum controlling the clock's speed. The impact was purely random, based on human whim, not physics. The pendulum shattered. The clock stopped. The collapse of order. The sudden cessation of the clock's timekeeping function, combined with the extreme temporal slowdown Finch had engineered, created a chaotic and final temporal feedback loop. The cartographer screamed, not in pain, but in sheer geometric terror, as his perfect, ordered world dissolved. The temporal frequency that defined him was gone. He did not vanish. He did not explode. Instead, the man began to reverse. The carefully tailored 1921 suit shimmered, reverting to the severe 1903 suit, then the dusty 1893 attire, and finally settling on the plain, outdated clothes of an ambitious but failed inventor from the 1880s. He was losing his temporal consistency, forced to relive the failures he had fought so hard to erase. The cartographer stumbled back into the shadows of the clock chamber, his face now etched with the uncertainty and fear of the original unaccelerated man. He was trapped in the continuous loop of his own insignificant past. The great acceleration ended. The lights of Times Square, powered by the now destabilized grid, returned to the flickering, hesitant pace of 1914. History snapped back, imperfect, chaotic, and free. Abigail climbed the ladder, finding Eleanor and Finch exhausted but victorious. "The city is returned," Abigail confirmed, looking out at the gaslit street below. "The future is ours again." Eleanor looked at the shattered clock, then at the empty shadows where the cartographer had been consumed by his own past. They had saved the timeline, but they were now irrevocably changed. Their work, however, was not over. They were now the only three people who knew how fragile reality was, the watchers of the grid, forever bound to the rhythm of a world they knew could break.